The morning rush at Lou's Diner was always a little chaotic. The hiss of the grill, the clink of coffee cups, the hum of tired voices seeking comfort in pancakes and black coffee. But that morning, something in the rhythm was off. Marcus, the man everyone thought was just another customer in a worn leather jacket, noticed it before he even took his seat at the corner booth. He wasn't here for the food. He was the new owner, though no one in the room knew it yet. His eyes found her. A waitress, early 30s, sharp eyes that softened when she smiled, moving between tables with a precision that spoke of years in the trade, but her left hand, wrapped in a thin beige bandage, fingers stiff, knuckles swollen. Every time she reached for a coffee pot, a flinch of pain flickered across her face. He watched as she balanced 3 plates on one arm, refusing help from a younger coworker. She set the plates down, forced a smile, and tucked the injured hand close to her side, as if to keep it invisible. Marcus had seen injuries like that before, broken bones disguised as a little sprain, but what unsettled him was the way the rest of the staff moved around her, careful, quiet, almost afraid. It was as if there was a story in the air no one dared to speak. Then it happened. A man at the counter, mid-40s, broad frame, greasy baseball cap, snapped his fingers sharply. Coffee, now. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the kind of weight that came from knowing people wouldn't challenge him. The waitress turned, nodded quickly, and reached for the pot. She used her good hand, but as she poured, her injured wrist brushed the rim of the mug. The jolt of pain was quick but visible. "You trying to spill it all over me," the man muttered, leaning in too close. She murmured an apology. And Marcus noticed her shoulders tighten, not from fear of losing a tip, but from something heavier, something older. That's when Marcus decided. He wasn't just here to quietly observe operations for a week before introducing himself as the new owner. This had just become personal. He leaned back in his booth, watching, waiting, storing every detail. The way she avoided eye contact with the man in the cap. The way other staff glanced at the clock whenever he spoke. The way she gripped the coffee pot tighter after each interaction, as though holding on to something more than just glass and caffeine. Something in Marcus Siston's chest tightened. She didn't know it yet, he thought, but this was the day everything would change. And here's the truth. When you step into a new environment, there are always 2 realities, the one people show you, and the one they hide. Marcus had learned in business, and in life, that the real story isn't in the numbers on the ledger, it's in the silences, the glances, the tension no one names. That morning, the numbers didn't matter, the silence did. He knew he couldn't just walk in as the boss and demand answers. That would close the door. People reveal themselves in patterns, not confessions. He would need to let the day unfold, to be the stranger in the corner long enough to see what others missed. What he didn't realize, not yet, was that the truth behind that injured hand was going to shake him to his core, and the choice he'd have to make would test not just his leadership, but his belief in justice itself. Here sits what that moment teaches us. If you want to understand the heart of any place, a business, a community, a relationship, watch how it treats the most vulnerable person in the room, because that treatment will tell you more than any polished mission statement ever could. Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, eyes still fixed on her. The man in the cap grinned without warmth, as if he'd won some invisible contest. Marcus Sitt's jaw tightened. A single action, he thought, could flip the entire outcome. The question was, which one? Her name was Denise Carter. Born and raised on the east side of the city, where the streets had long memories and the schools had short budgets. By the time she was 14, Denise had already learned 2 truths. First, you can't always count on people to protect you. And second, sometimes survival means pretending you're fine when you're not. She'd been a waitress for over a decade, first at chain diners, then small mom-and-pop joints. Always the one who could remember a customer's order without writing it down. Always smiling, even when her feet ached so badly she could barely walk home. But 2 years ago, life had collapsed in on her. Her husband James, a truck driver she'd been with since she was 19, walked out, leaving her with a 6-year-old son and a stack of bills taller than the fridge. The child support checks came late, if at all. She picked up double shifts to keep the lights on, sometimes falling asleep at the kitchen table with her head on a pile of unpaid invoices. The injury was recent, just 10 days old. She told people she'd fallen on ice behind the diner during a cigarette break. That was the story. It wasn't the truth. Marcus didn't know any of this yet, but the signs were already there if you knew how to read them. The way her injured hand trembled when she lifted a tray. The stiffness in her back when the man in the cap, his name as Marcus would later learn, was Earl Simmons, walked through the door. Earl wasn't just any customer, he was the nephew of the former owner, and in his mind that gave him ownership of the space, the right to a free meal now and then, the right to speak to the staff, like they were part of his inheritance. He'd been in the diner nearly every day since Marcus quietly purchased it. His presence was a shadow over the place, tolerated but never welcomed, and when he looked at Denise, it wasn't as a human being, it was as someone who could be ordered, interrupted, dismissed. But there was another layer to this. The diner's old management had run it with a family-first philosophy. Only in this family, loyalty meant silence. If someone crossed the line, a sharp word, a wandering hand, you were expected to shrug it off. Complaints made trouble, and trouble meant shifts cut, schedules changed, tips reduced. Denise had learned to endure, to swallow her pride in exchange for keeping her job, and the staff, most of them, had learned to look away. It sits a dangerous cycle, one that sits been mapped by psychologists for decades. Systemic tolerance for small abuses, ignored until they grow. Social reinforcement of silence, the group punishes the one who speaks up, not the one who causes harm. Erosion of personal agency, the target begins to believe that pushing back isn't worth the cost. Denise was deep in stage 3. She didn't know that the man in the corner booth, the one watching her with quiet intensity, had made a career out of finding these patterns and dismantling them. Marcus wasn't just a businessman. Before he'd owned restaurants, he'd worked as a corporate turnaround consultant. His specialty? Walking into broken systems, finding the real rot, and replacing it with something unbreakable. But here's the thing about systems, they protect themselves. You don't just walk in and fix them, you have to pull one thread at a time, until the whole fabric unravels. And Marcus knew, deep in his bones, that Denise's injury was the thread. He finished his coffee, watched her refill a customer's glass of orange juice with her good hand, forcing a laugh at some bad joke. She doesn't know it yet, Marcus thought, but the way she got that injury is about to be the end of this diner, as it sits been run. The question now wasn't whether he would intervene, it was how. And the wrong move could cost him not just the truth, but her trust. By noon, the diner was buzzing, the grill sizzled, forks clinked against plates, and the bell above the door kept chiming with the lunch rush. Denise moved like a shadow between tables, never staying still long enough for Marcus to catch her alone. He watched her work, one-handed, every movement calculated to hide the pain, but the moment came faster than he expected. Earl Simmons was back from his cigarette break, leaning against the counter like he owned it. Denise was at the register, counting change for a young mother with 2 kids. Earl stepped in behind her, close enough that Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders from across the room. "Hey sweetheart," Earl said, his voice low, oily. "You still owe me that refill from this morning." She didn't turn around. "I still get to it when I can." "Earl?" Marcus noted the sharpness in her tone, controlled but firm. It was the first time he'd seen her push back, even slightly. Earl smiled without warmth. "Careful now, you wouldn't want me telling folks you you're slipping." The words were quiet, but Marcus saw how they landed. Denise froze for just a moment, then forced herself to keep moving. Here it was, the fork in the road. Marcus could step in right now, reveal himself as the owner, cut through the tension, and put Earl in his place. But if he did, 2 things would happen. Earl would know immediately who had power, and power invites resistance. Denise would see him as another authority figure swooping in, not as someone who understood the depth of what was happening. There was another choice. Say nothing. Stay undercover. Wait for the moment when Earl's behavior crossed a line so clear that Marcus could not only act, but justify that action publicly, making it unshakable. But there was risk in waiting. Inaction can look like complicity, especially to someone who's been let down before. Psychologists call this the witness dilemma, the tension between intervening too early and undermining trust, versus waiting too long and losing moral credibility. In leadership, the timing of action can be the difference between building a movement and standing alone. Marcus waited in real time. His instinct as a strategist told him, let him hang himself with his own rope. His instinct as a human being told him, she needs an ally now? And Denise, she had her own fork in the road. She could file Earl's comment under just another day, and keep her head down. Or she could make it known, to Marcus, to the other staff, to herself, that she wasn't going to let this slide. As the mother and her kids left, Denise turned to Earl, voice low but steady. You want your refill? You wait like everybody else. It was small, but it was something. Marcus caught the flicker of surprise in Earl's eyes, quickly masked with a smirk. Earl leaned back, raising his hands as if to say, no harm, no foul. But Marcus knew the game. Predators in power rarely back down after being checked. They just wait for the next opening, and when they come back, they come harder. The lunch rush thinned. Marcus paid for his meal in cash, left a generous tip and stepped outside, but only for the staff to believe he'd gone. He circled back to the alley behind the diner, leaning against the brick wall, just out of sight. 5 minutes later, the back door swung open. Denise stepped out, cradling her injured hand. She lit a cigarette, exhaling slow. Her eyes scanned the street like she was bracing for something. The door opened again. Earl. No smile this time, just that quiet, entitled anger. You think you can talk to me like that in front of people? He said. Marcus could hear every word. Denise's jaw tightened. I think you can pour your own coffee. And that right there, was the moment. Marcus felt the decision harden inside him. The game was over. The only question left was how he would flip the entire outcome, without losing the element of surprise. Marcus didn't move from his spot in the alley. His instincts told him this was a moment to observe, not yet to confront. Sometimes, the power to shift a situation comes from understanding the battlefield before making your move. Earl leaned closer to Denise, but she didn't step back. She simply flicked ash from her cigarette with her good hand, and looked him dead in the eye. You think just 'cause your uncle used to run this place, you can talk to me however you want, she said, her voice low and steady. Earl smirked, leaning one arm on the wall beside her. Sweetheart, I can talk to you however I like. You gonna run to the boss? Oh wait, you wouldn't want him hearing about certain things, would you? Marcus caught it, the veiled threat, the kind meant to keep her quiet. It was the kind of move he'd seen in corporate boardrooms and street corners alike, intimidation disguised as familiarity. But Denise, she didn't flinch, not this time. She exhaled another stream of smoke and said, You don't scare me, Earl, not anymore. That was when Marcus saw it, not defiance for the sake of pride, but a measured resistance. She had been calculating her pushback, choosing her moments. This wasn't a woman broken, this was a woman biding her time. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Strength doesn't always look like swinging back the first chance you get. Sometimes it's the patience to wait until you can land a blow that actually changes the game. Marcus made his move, not toward them, but back inside. He walked past the register and into the kitchen, where the cook, an older man named Hank, was flipping burgers. Marcus struck up a conversation as if he were just another regular. You work with Denise long? Marcus asked. Hank glanced over his shoulder. Too long for her own good. She sits the best waitress we got. But this place? He shook his head. Old owner didn't care as long as the bills were paid. Marcus nodded. And Earl? Hank sipped spatula, froze midair. Best keep your questions to yourself, friend. Earl Sepp's family Sips's, untouchable. That was the confirmation Marcus needed. A system was in place, one that rewarded loyalty to the wrong people, and punished anyone who stepped out of line. Now here sits where Marcus' hidden power came in. The diner wasn't his first turnaround project. He owned 3 other businesses before, all of them struggling, all of them in communities where power had calcified in the wrong hands, and he had a playbook. Gather intelligence quietly. Identify the pressure points. Create an undeniable public moment that forces change. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had a plan forming. First, he asked Hank casually if the diner still used the old supply chain for produce and meat. Hank grumbled something about invoices and prices being all over the place. Marcus stored that away. Inconsistent suppliers meant leverage, financial, legal, or both. Second, he started chatting with customers. Listening, learning which ones had been coming in for years, and what they thought of the place. Every complaint, every fond memory, every name that came up more than once, went into the mental file. And third, he watched Denise work. She wasn't just good, she was strategic. She remembered orders without writing them down. Yes, but she also staggered her tables, so no one was left waiting too long. Even when she was in pain, she noticed when a kid's drink was low before the parents did. She refilled without being asked. Marcus knew from behavioral science that these micro-interventions, small proactive actions, build not just tips, but loyalty. In the right conditions, loyalty becomes collective defense. Denise didn't know it yet, but she already had an army. It just needed awakening. By the time Earl re-entered the diner, Marcus was back in his corner booth, sipping coffee like he'd never left. Earl shot Denise a look, but she brushed past him, refilling another customer's cup, without even glancing his way. The balance hadn't shifted yet, but the cracks were forming. And Marcus was about to widen them. It happened during the Friday dinner rush, the busiest stretch of the week. The diner was packed wall to wall, the air thick with the smell of fried chicken, and the steady hum of overlapping conversations. Denise was moving faster than Marcus had seen all week, her good hand juggling plates, coffee pots, and credit card slips like a magician's act. Sweat clung to her temples, but she kept the smile, that quiet, unshakable smile, plastered on. Then Earl walked in. No hurry, no purpose, just that slow swagger of a man who knows no one will make him leave. He slid into the counter seat closest to the register, in perfect view of the entire diner. Marcus had been tracking patterns all week, and this was one of them. Earl liked to make his moves when the room was full, public enough to humiliate, private enough that no one would call the police. Denise passed behind him, balancing a tray with 3 plates. Earl reached out and brushed her injured hand. Not a shove, not a grab, just enough to send a shock of pain through her face before she could mask it. The tray wobbled. 1 plate slipped. Time slowed. The crash of ceramic hitting tile cut through the chatter. Heads turned. Denise froze for half a second, just long enough for Earl to speak, his voice pitched so every ear could hear. "Guess you sir not as quick as you used to be, huh?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the room. Not everyone laughed, but no one stopped him. Denise bent to pick up the shards, her cheeks flushing red. Marcus saw it, the way her hands trembled, not from the weight of the plates but from the weight of the eyes on her. In her mind this wasn't just a drop dish, it was confirmation of every whispered doubt, every quiet dismissal, every moment someone had made her feel small. Hank came out from the kitchen, muttering, "Watch yourself, Denise," not to Earl, to her, as if she were the problem. Here sits the dangerous part of systems like this. They're self-reinforcing. The person being targeted gets framed as the one at fault, and the people around them, whether out of fear, habit, or convenience, play along. That's how injustice hides in plain sight. Marcus felt the frustration rising in his chest. His plan had been to wait, to create a perfect moment of public reversal, but watching her crouch on the floor, while Earl leaned back with that smug grin, it tested every ounce of restraint he had. Still, he stayed put. Because he knew something about crowds. Intervene too early, and people will remember the scene as a messy argument. Intervene at the exact right moment, and they'll remember it as a reckoning. But then Earl upped the ante. "Careful down there," he said, smirking. "Wouldn't must want you to hurt the other hand. Then what use would you be?" A low murmur swept the diner. Even the ones who normally stayed quiet shifted in their seats. It was subtle, but Marcus caught it, the first sign that the crowd's tolerance was cracking. Denise straightened, holding the broken plate pieces in her good hand. She looked at Earl, and for a second Marcus thought she might say something. But then she lowered her eyes and carried the shards to the back. She didn't see the look on Earl's face, the self-satisfaction of a man who thought he'd won. Marcus did. And he made a decision. The next time Earl stepped out of line, and Marcus knew there would be a next time, he would not only shut it down, but do it in a way that dismantled the diner's old hierarchy for good. But before that could happen, the system itself was going to push back harder, and when it did, it wouldn't just target Denise, it would target anyone seen as standing too close to her. Including him. It was just past closing when the last customer left. Chairs were flipped onto tables, the coffee pot sat empty, and the neon sign out front flickered weakly against the dark street. Denise stood by the sink, rinsing glasses one-handed. The other staff had already gone home. She liked it that way. The quiet after the storm gave her space to breathe, and to drop the mask she wore all day. Marcus stayed seated in his corner booth. Technically he had no reason to still be there, but something in him knew that moments of truth rarely happened during business hours. From the kitchen doorway, he could see her wince as she twisted a glass too far in her injured hand. She set it down hard, water sloshing over the rim. Then she leaned against the counter, staring at the wall like she was seeing something miles away. That's when her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, read the message, and her face went still. She put the phone down, screen face down, and gripped the edge of the counter. Marcus couldn't see the message, but he didn't have to. The body language said enough. A sharp inhale, shoulders tensing, jaw tightening. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked gently. She startled, clearly unaware he was still there. "Yeah, fine, just tired." He nodded, letting the silence stretch. Silence, he'd learned, is a tool. People fill it when they need to be heard. After a moment, she sighed. "My ex wants to change the custody schedule again. Says I sip not sep stable sippin' enough for full weekends." Marcus studied her face. "You didn't say anything to him?" She shook her head. "What sits the point? People like him, they always find a way to win." There it was, the fracture line. Not just about Earl, not just about the diner. This was about a lifetime of being told she couldn't fight, or worse, that fighting wouldn't matter. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You know there sits a thing in behavioral science called sets learned helplessness. This when someone sits been knocked down so many times, they start to believe getting up isn't sits worth it, even when the fight is winnable." She gave him a sideways look. "You a professor or something?" "Something like that," he said, with a faint smile. Then he added, "But here sits the thing about learned helplessness. It sits reversible. One small win, one can change the entire trajectory. Doesn't sit even have to be big, just has to be yours." Denise didn't answer, but she didn't look away either, and Marcus knew she'd heard him. As she turned back to the sink, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an email, a forwarded file from his attorney, the final transfer documents for the diner. The old ownership structure was officially dissolved. He now had complete operational control. For Marcus, this was the missing piece. Until now, his authority had been partial, enough to observe, not enough to act without backlash from the old owner's allies. But now the playbook was wide open. It's what that moment teaches us. Transformation isn't about having the power from the start, it's about knowing when the moment has come to use it. Marcus stood, dropping cash on the table for the coffee he didn't really drink. "You're here tomorrow morning?" he asked. "Always," she said. "Good," he replied, heading for the door. "Tomorrow sit's going to be different." He didn't explain. Didn't need to. Because in his mind the plan had shifted from quiet observation to active dismantling, and Denise, whether she was ready or not, was going to be part of it. The next morning, Marcus arrived before the sun. The diner's windows were still dark, the street quiet except for the hum of a distant delivery truck. He unlocked the door with a key only the owner should have, because now he was the owner in every sense. Inside, he didn't go straight to the office. He went to the kitchen, pulled out a clipboard, began flipping through invoices, supplier contracts, payroll logs. Years of disorganization stared back at him, but disorganization wasn't just sloppy, it was leverage. By the time Hank arrived, Marcus had a pot of coffee brewing, and the invoices spread out across the counter. "You stashed here early," Hank said, suspicious. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus replied. "Mind if I ask you a few questions about these supplier orders?" Hank shrugged. "Sure, but good luck getting a straight answer from anyone." Marcus smiled slightly. "I don't need straight answers, just the truth." As they talked, Marcus took mental notes. The meat supplier was overcharging, produce deliveries were often short, and there was no consistent paper trail for cash transactions. In a small business, these weren't just inefficiencies, they were pressure points. And whoever controlled those pressure points, controlled the business culture. By mid-morning, Marcus was working on step 2, building allies. He spoke to the dishwasher, a quiet teenager named Luis, and learned that Earl often skimmed tips left on the counter when no one was watching. He chatted with regulars, and subtly asked about the diner's vibe lately. Several mentioned that Denise was the only reason we keep coming back. Marcus filed that away. Denise wasn't just a good waitress, she was the social glue holding the customer base together, and that meant she had more power than she realized. He didn't tell her any of this. Not yet. Instead he began shifting small things in her favor. Adjusting the table rotation, so she got the regulars, who tipped well. Quietly covering her most physically demanding tasks without making it obvious. Making sure the coffee pot closest to her section was always fresh, so she didn't have to walk the extra steps. Each move was small enough to avoid suspicion, but together, they created breathing room. Breathing room creates confidence, and confidence, he knew, would be the foundation for what came next. Meanwhile, Marcus set the trap for Earl. It wasn't going to be a private confrontation. Those could be denied, twisted. No, this would be public, undeniable, and backed by evidence. The opportunity came when Marcus learned about the diner's customer appreciation night, a tradition the old owner had kept for years. Free coffee and pie for regulars, live music in the corner, and every table full. Earl never missed it. Marcus decided that was the night. He contacted the supplier. Earl had been siphoning goods from an old friend, owed Marcus a favor, and agreed to send over the exact delivery records, complete with timestamps, matching them to Earl's appearances in the diner. By the end of the week, Marcus had a neat little package, proof Earl had been taking advantage of both the diner and the staff. But he didn't just sit on the evidence, he positioned it. He made sure Hank, Luis, and the most outspoken regulars knew, without saying it directly, that change was coming. This is what strategists call soft alignment, preparing the ground so that when the decisive moment happens, the crowd is already leaning toward your side. By the time Customer Appreciation Night rolled around, the diner felt different, not fixed, but less heavy. Denise even laughed, really laughed with a table of regulars, something Marcus hadn't seen before. She didn't know it yet, but the stage was set. And Earl was about to walk right into it. Customer Appreciation Night had the diner bursting at the seams. Every table was full, the hum of conversation mixing with the soft twang of a guitar in the corner. The smell of fresh pie and strong coffee wrapped the room in a kind of nostalgia that made people linger. Marcus was in his usual corner booth, but this time he wasn't just watching. Every detail tonight was orchestrated. The seating, the timing of deliveries, even the position of the coffee pots. The players were all in place. Denise moved with a rhythm Marcus hadn't seen in weeks. The injured hand was still bandaged, but she was faster, lighter, as if something in her had begun to believe she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Then Earl walked in. The room shifted, not a hush, but a subtle tightening of the air. Regulars saw him and looked away. A few staff members stiffened, but Earl didn't notice, or didn't care. He took his usual spot at the counter, leaning back like it was a throne. Denise approached with a coffee pot in her good hand. "Evening, Earl," she said, her tone neutral. He smirked. "Well, look at you. Almost dropped that cup last week, didn't sit you. Hope you've got a better grip tonight." A few customers glanced over. Denise didn't rise to the bait. She poured the coffee and walked away. Marcus knew the trap required one thing. Earl crossing a line so clear, no one could pretend it didn't happen. And Earl, arrogant, entitled, predictable, never could resist pushing too far. It came 20 minutes later. Denise was serving pie to a table of regulars, when Earl called out, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Hey sweetheart, you planning to serve me, or is that busted hand slowing you down again?" The guitar in the corner faltered. Conversations dimmed. Denise froze. Earl grinned, sensing the attention. "Maybe you should just stick to smiling at the customers, huh? Leave the real work to someone who can handle it." Marcus stood, calm, controlled, but his presence was like a current moving through the room. He walked to the counter, setting a manila folder in front of Earl. "You know," Marcus said, his voice steady, "I been meaning to talk to you about the real work you been doing here." Earl frowned. "Who are you?" Marcus met his gaze. "I am the owner, as of last week, fully and officially, which means everything that happens in this diner, including your little side business with the suppliers, is my responsibility to address." A ripple of whispers swept the room. Earl Sepp's smirk faltered. "I don't know what you steer talking about." Marcus opened the folder, revealing copies of the supplier invoices, side by side with timestamps of Earl Sepp's appearances. "You've been helping yourself to goods that were paid for by this diner. You've been skimming tips, and you've been harassing staff." He let the words hang in the air. "Now I could handle this privately, but the thing about private conversations," Marcus continued, "is that they can be denied, so I think it's best we clear this up in front of everyone." Earl shifted in his seat, scanning the faces around him. No one looked away this time. Hank was watching from the kitchen doorway. Louise stood in the back, arms crossed. Even the guitarist had set down his instrument. Denise didn't move. She just stood there, eyes fixed on Earl, waiting. Marcus leaned in slightly. "So Earl, here sits the question. Do you want to leave quietly, or should I have the police meet you here in 10 minutes, because I already made the call?" The color drained from Earl's face. He looked around again, but the room was closed to him now. No allies, no soft landing. He stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath, and pushed past Marcus toward the door. The bell jingled once, as it shut behind him. Silence. Then, a low wave of murmurs. Relief, approval. Marcus turned to Denise. "You okay?" She nodded slowly, and in that nod was something more than thanks. It was the beginning of belief, in herself, and in the idea that the rules of this place had just changed. The next morning, the diner felt different, not louder, not busier, just lighter, like someone had opened a window and let fresh air in after years of it being shut. Earl didn't sit show, neither did his shadow. For years, his presence had been like background noise, not always loud, but always there. People had learned to work around it, adjust themselves to avoid friction. Now, with him gone, those adjustments began to fall away. Customers noticed first. Regulars who had once kept their heads down greeted Denise with warmth, lingering in conversation instead of hurrying out. Tips were a little higher, smiles a little more frequent. Marcus noticed too. Denise's movements were still careful, the injured hand wasn't healed, but there was no heaviness in her steps. She wasn't watching the door between tables. In the kitchen, Hank cornered Marcus. "I don't know what you did, but the kid in the back says Earl won't be coming around anymore." Marcus just nodded. "That's right." Hank studied him for a beat. "Good, about time." And that was the ripple effect Marcus had been counting on. When you remove a toxic presence, you don't just protect the target. You change how the bystanders see themselves. They go from silent observers to participants in the new order. That afternoon, Denise approached Marcus between shifts. "I heard you're the owner now," she said, almost teasing. "That's right," Marcus replied. "You could have told me?" "I could have," he said, "but then you wouldn't have shown me who you really are." She tilted her head, not quite sure how to take that. "Most people in your position would have checked out a long time ago," Marcus continued, "but you kept showing up, even with one hand down, even when no one had your back." Her eyes softened. "Didn't feel like I had much choice." "There's always a choice," Marcus said quietly, "even if the first one is small." They stood there for a moment, the hum of the diner filling the space between words. Here's what Marcus knew from years of watching turnarounds happen. Change isn't complete until it's claimed. He could remove Earl, change policies, adjust schedules, but if Denise didn't own the shift in power, the old system could sneak back in. That evening, Marcus made it official. He called a staff meeting after closing. No suits, no corporate jargon, just him, standing at the counter, speaking plainly. "This diner sits under new ownership," he said. "That means a new standard. No one here is untouchable. No one here works in fear. If someone crosses the line, you bring it to me, and I will act." He didn't look at Denise when he said it. He didn't need to. Then he turned to Hank. "Pay raise for Denise, effective immediately, and her schedule. She picks her shifts until her hand heals." Hank nodded without question. Denise's mouth opened, then closed. She didn't argue, but she didn't say thank you either, not yet. Marcus knew she was still testing the permanence of this change. 2 days later she gave her answer. It came in the form of a quiet moment during the lunch rush. She passed Marcus Sip's booth, paused and said, "Hey, thanks for not just stepping in, thanks for fixing it." Marcus smiled. "You did the hard part, you stayed." And with that, the arc had closed, not in a blaze of glory but in the steady warmth of something rebuilt. Months later, the diner was almost unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. The regulars still sat in their favorite booths. The same clock still ticked on the far wall. The same scent of coffee and cinnamon still wrapped itself around every newcomer who stepped inside. But there was no longer that subtle edge in the air, the quiet flinch when certain footsteps approached. Denise now moved through the room with confidence that wasn't forced. The bandages were gone, the hand healed, but what had really mended was harder to see, the invisible fracture of working under constant threat. Marcus had shifted to a more distant role, letting the team run the day-to-day, but he came by every week, not as a hidden observer anymore, but as a mentor who'd become part of the story. One evening, as the last of the customers left, Denise walked over with 2 mugs of coffee. She slid one toward him and sat down. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been here that night?" she asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. He was careful with questions like that. They had a way of making people cling to hypotheticals. Finally he said, "What matters isn't set whether I was here. What matters is you were." She gave a small laugh, shaking her head. "You start making it sound like I had a choice." Marcus leaned forward. "You did. You could Sip stayed quiet. Could Sips walked away, but you stayed. You pushed back, even when you thought no one saw it. That Sips what made the rest possible." She didn't reply, but her eyes said she understood. Here sits what that moment teaches us. When systems of injustice take root, whether in a workplace, a community or a country, they rarely start with grand acts of cruelty. They start with small imbalances, tolerated over time, a stolen tip, a public insult that goes unchallenged, a bruise explained away. The danger isn't just in the act itself, it's in the normalization of it, the quiet conditioning that tells people, this is just how it is here. That's why transformation isn't always loud. Sometimes, it begins in the smallest defiance, in a decision to keep showing up, even when no one is clapping. A single action flipped the entire outcome of this diner, removing one toxic presence. But the deeper truth is this: the system that allowed him to operate needed changing just as much as the man himself. Marcus understood this. Leaders worth following always do. They don't just protect individuals, they rebuild the environment so the same harm can't take root again. If you've ever been in a place where someone's abuse of power was just the way things are, I want you to remember something. The first person to stand up rarely feels like a hero. They feel scared, uncertain, and very, very alone. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that the cost of staying silent is higher than the risk of speaking. Denise didn't know it yet, but the night Earl left was the beginning of a legacy she'd carry into every future job, every future conflict. She had seen firsthand that the ground could shift, and that she could be part of shifting it. And here's your takeaway. Wherever you are, work, school, community, look for the places where silence has settled in, and then ask yourself, what's one small action I could take to disturb it? Because change doesn't always come from sweeping reforms or public battles. Sometimes it starts with a quiet act of resistance, followed by another, and another. If this story resonated with your values, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep telling the stories that remind us, change is possible, and that each of us holds a piece of the power to make it happen. Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe in standing up, speaking out, and building places where dignity is non-negotiable.